and we are on Yud Beis Amid Beis 12b in Eruvin, and the question is whether a lechi or korah, the vertical post on the side of an alleyway that is opening, or the horizontal crossbeam at the top of the alleyway opening, whether those function as a reminder demarcation of the end of the line or of the end of the alleyway, or is it acting like a barrier, and it's really a part of the wall, if we would. So Esav, we ask a question. Rabbi Yaakov bar Abba asked Rava, somebody throws something, meaning he carries from the public domain into an alleyway that has a lechi, that has a vertical post. Chayiv is going to transgress. Ein lo lechi, pater. Then he does not transgress on a Torah level. And the lechi, the Torah, we saw that the Torah obligation and the chatas that somebody would have to bring for inadvertently transgressing is when somebody brings when somebody carries from a public domain into a private domain. And a private domain, we said, would be something that has three walls, and then the lechi is what's making the fourth wall. And you see that it only counts as a Torah obligation if you carried into a space that actually has that lechi, that fourth wall. But if the lechi is only acting as a reminder, here's the end of the alleyway, so then what difference does it make whether it's there or not? On a Torah level, either way is going to be a private domain, and carrying from the public into there is going to be transgression. The only difference is that you need the reminder not to carry out when you're carrying inside. So the fact that this makes a distinction between whether or not it has this vertical post, the lechi on the side, seems to be that the lechi is what's going to create the definition of the alleyway, of the private domain, which tells me that is a wall. It's acting as an actual barrier. So Rava responds and says, actually, no, that's not the meaning. Rather, if all it requires is a lechi, meaning that it is a cul-de-sac, it's not a alleyway that you can walk through from one side to the other. Since it is a cul-de-sac, it's a dead end. Therefore, all it requires is a lechi. That's what it means. And since all it requires is a lechi, therefore it tells me that it has three proper walls. If it has three proper walls, it's a Torah level private domain. If you carry from the public domain into there, you will have transgressed the Torah prohibition, and you need a chatas offering. But if it requires, besides for the vertical post of lechi, it also needs another accommodation made in order to make it allowable to carry in there. Meaning, on the other side, the other opening also needs something. Oh, so that means right now it's not a private domain on a Torah level, and therefore, if somebody carries into it, he will not have to bring a chatas offering. Would be exempt. As a way, we try and prove it from this halacha. Yes, sir. Rabbi Yehuda said further, and we saw this earlier. This is about building one house on top of another house, a room on top of another house, and carrying. He says a further thing: if you have two houses on either side of the road, on the main road is going to be a Torah level public domain, and you have a house on both sides. So on the one side of the street, at the beginning of your property, you make a vertical post, and at the end of the property, you make a vertical post. And by doing so, you have two walls on either side of the street because of your houses. And on the one side, you've also put a post at the beginning and end of your property. Now you're allowed to carry straight across the public domain. You can carry in between. So we see Amrullah and the Chachamim disagree with him and say, you can't make that as that's a public domain. You can't turn it into a private domain that way, right? But what you see is that Rabbi Yehuda held that you could. Now, how does that change how does it change it into a private domain? Must be that the vertical post or the horizontal crossbeam act as a wall, and therefore the two walls on either side of the street because of the house, plus the vertical posts or the horizontal post means it has four walls. So therefore, you see that the lechi or the kara act as an actual wall. Gemara says, no, that's not true. Hasam kesavar Rabbi Yehuda shtei mechitzas daraisa. The reason is because Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that in order to define a private domain on a Torah level, it's sufficient to have two walls on the two sides of the property, and that would count as a private domain. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, if you have an alleyway, and the alleyway is as wide as it is long, and in other words, it's a square, it's not sufficient to have just a thin, almost nothing there, lechi, vertical post. That's not going to be sufficient. That's only going to be sufficient for a mavui. And we've seen this earlier. A mavui, an alleyway by definition, requires that the length of it is longer than the width, meaning on the wall that you have, the side that you have the opening is going to be perpendicular to the two long walls, which are parallel to each other. And then at the other end, you have a wall. That is the definition of a mavui. But if it is square or it is wider than long, then it's not going to count as a mavui. And similarly, Rav would say that you can't, that the cross beam also won't work unless it's a proper mavui, which has the length longer than its width. How exacting is the teaching of these elders? Because if it's square, long as it is wide, its definition is now a chutzner, a courtyard, and not an alleyway. And we've seen already earlier that a simple vertical post on the side or a crossbeam above don't work for a chutzner, for a courtyard. A courtyard, in order to be permissible to carry within it, the opening has to be enclosed with a wall of four, right? It has to have at least 4 tefachim, let's say 12 inches. That's that kind of board is going to have to be the wall at its opening side, and then the opening is going to be okay to be an opening to carry with it. However, if there's a question, this is going to be the question. Let this vertical post just be like a board. And it should be permissible. And the Gemara says the question indicated that he thought that for a courtyard, it would be sufficient to just have a simple post. And that's not true. As we just saw, it needs to have at least 4 tefachim. And he had forgotten this teaching in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that for a courtyard, the opening requires 4 tefachim. Amar Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman says, and here's the idea of what's an alleyway and what's a courtyard. What counts as an alleyway, which would then be permissible to carry within if you just have at its opening a vertical post or horizontal post? What's going to count? Here are the criteria. It has to be that the length is longer than its width. And it has houses and courtyards within which each has 2 houses open to it. So it has to have multiple dwellings in there. Either 2 courtyards, each courtyard by definition has 2 houses in there, or it can have 1 courtyard and a house. But it would require multiple dwellings and this public road that services both of these, at least the 2 dwellings. That would count as an alleyway. What does not count as that and counts as a courtyard, which has a stricter a requirement for its opening in order to be allowed to carry in there. And therefore, it's not permissible with just putting a vertical post or horizontal post. It requires at least a 4 tefachim a board at its opening, or wall at its opening. Kosher merubas, anything that's square. Merubas in agulaloi, and if it's round, not. What it means is, if it's wider than it is, if it's longer than it is wide, it's a mavi, it's an alleyway. And that's going to be sufficient with a lechem ikar. However, iloi havali chotzer. But if it's not longer than it is wide, rather it's square or wider than it is long or circular, havali chotzer, that's going to be defined as a courtyard. But and for that, you're going to have, like we saw, a wall of 4 tefachim minimal at its opening in order to count. Now, how much longer does that have to be than it is wide in order to count as an alleyway? So Shmuel first wanted to say that it has to be double the length than it is its width. So Rav said, no, this is what my uncle said. Reb Chia, who was his uncle, this is what my uncle said, Afil Mashu. Even if it's just a minuscule amount longer than it is wide, that's sufficient. So if it's 10 amos wide and it's 10 and a half amos long, that counts as an alleyway. And in the Mishnah has a machlokes, what was the opinion of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel? So in the first opinion, the Mishnah said that Beis Shammai says that an alleyway needs both a lechi and a korah, a vertical and horizontal beam. And Beis Hillel say, no, it's either or. To which Rabbi Eliezer said it needs 2 lechis, a vertical post on either side of the opening. And Rabbi Shmuel said in the name of a certain student, in the name of Rabbi Shmuel, a certain student said that Beis Shammai Beis Hillel did not disagree about this matter. And then Rabbi Akiva said, no, they did disagree about this matter. So Rabbi Akiva says, no, there was a disagreement about both. So Rabbi Akiva is really the first opinion. So why does the Mishnah tell us Rabbi Akiva's responding and saying that it is that Beis Shammai Beis Hillel did disagree about whether or not any sized alleyway needs a vertical and horizontal post, or only vertical or only horizontal? So Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva in the first opinion seem to be saying the same. There is a distinction on, is there a minimum size of the opening in the alleyway, which we saw earlier could be that the minimum size of the opening alleyway is 4 tefachim. Any smaller than that, which 12 inches, any less than that doesn't count as an opening, and therefore you don't even need a vertical post, according to one opinion. But we don't know who the first opinion, or Rabbi Akiva, is the one that's going to be lenient in that case. Tanya. So now the Gemara is going to come in and tell us some history about Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva. Tanya, we learned in a brayso, Amar Rabbi Akiva le Amar Rabbi Shmuel davazeh. Rabbi Shmuel never said this teaching. Rabbi Shmuel never said that Beis Shammai Beis Hillel didn't argue about this. Elo is a Talmud Amar. Oh, it's that student who said it. Davazeh. V'halacha is a Talmud, and the halacha is like that student. The Gemara says, wait, you're just saying that Rabbi Shmuel never said this, and now you're saying the halacha is like that student? So the Gemara says, you're telling me Rabbi Shmuel never said this, and then you say, which indicates that it's incorrect, and the halacha shouldn't be that way. And then you say, Rabbi Akiva said, the halacha is like that Talmud. How can that be? Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Amar Rabbi Akiva, Ela l'chadid b'asat talmidim, or l'chabed b'asat talmidim. That Rabbi Akiva only said this to enhance the studies of the students. He didn't want that the students not be motivated to study and to think and to elaborate and to speak up. If he would shut the student down and say, Rabbi Shmuel never said that, he was afraid that the students would be afraid to speak up. So even though he wanted the students to know that that's the case, he wanted to encourage a student to continue debating and learning and working. And so he said, Rabbi Akiva said that Rabbi Shmuel never said it. It is the student himself who said it. But it's correct enough that the halacha is like that, even though the halacha is not that way. And he figured the students will figure that out by the fact that he's saying, don't worry, Rabbi Shmuel never said that. But nevertheless, he wanted the student to feel validated enough to continue learning and articulating and speaking up. And so he said, the halacha is like it. That he didn't say the halacha is like the student. He said, but the student said, it seems like he's saying correct things. Not that the halacha is that way. Either way, it was done in order to encourage the students to continue speaking up and learning. Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi. So Rabbi Shua ben Levi says, Kol makom shatam moitzim mishum Rabbi Shmuel Amar Talmud Echad. Anytime you find in the Mishnaic texts that there's a quote, a certain student quoting Rabbi Yishmael, Lefnei Rabbi Akiva, and speaking up in front of Rabbi Akiva, Eine Ela Rabbi Meir. That is always going to be a quote of Rabbi Meir. Shashim says Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Akiva, because he studied under and served both Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shmuel, and Rabbi Akiva. The Tanya, as we learned, Amar Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir told of his story. When I was studying under Rabbi Yishmael, I would put kankantum, which is a type of iron, and dye into the ink, so that it lasts longer. And Rabbi Shmuel did not tell me that I was doing the wrong thing. But when I came to study under Rabbi Akiva, Asra Allah, he forbade it from me. So you see, he started off as a student of Rabbi Shmuel, and then he came as a student of Rabbi Akiva. Eini, but that's not correct. But Shmuel said that in the name of Rabbi Meir, a different story. When I was studying under Rabbi Akiva, I would put kankantum, this iron, into the ink. And he didn't say anything to me. He didn't stop me. And when I came to Rabbi Shmuel, he said, "My son, what's your work? What skill do you have?" He said, as I told him, I'm a scribe. I can write nicely. So he said to me, "My son, be very careful in your work. Because the work you are doing is the work of heaven. You're writing Sifrei Torah, Tefillah, Mezuzah. Be careful, because if you add one letter or you're missing one letter, it can change the entire meaning and turn it into a terrible statement. And with that, you can destroy the world by changing the meaning of the Torah to its opposite. He said, don't worry about it. Rabbi Shmuel responded to Rabbi Meir responded to Rabbi Shmuel, oh, don't worry, teacher, because I put in this material called kankantum, this iron, which I put in the ink, and it stabilizes the ink. I said, wait, you can't do that. But the Torah said, in regards to the sota, the Torah says you will write this section of the Torah on parchment and erase it in the water, and that becomes the sota water that she drinks. So you see, the writing has to be erasable. And if you put in kankantum, this iron, it actually leaves its mark and it will not be erased. It has to be that it's a writing that can be erased. Micah Mashmalam. So what's the Micah Amalei or Micah Mahadele? What was the original statement that Rabbi Yishmael said to Rabbi Meir? And what did Rabbi Meir answer about having this kankantum in his ink? Hachi Kamalei. This is what he said to him. He said, don't worry about the adding a letter or missing a letter. Now, if we're talking about letters that are just spelling, so we know in Hebrew you can have an O sound, both with a vav or without a vav. That's called a chaser if it doesn't have the vav, and male if it has the vav. So I can write Yaakov, let's say, for instance, with Yud Ayin Kuf Vav base. That's Yaakov, or I can write it without that. So if you're worried that I don't know where it needs to be a full word, meaning it has the vowel letter as well or not, don't worry, I know that. Bakiani, I'm pretty well versed in that. So what are you concerned about? That maybe while I'm writing, there'll be a smudge, a fly will come onto the ink and it'll erase part of the a letter or something. No, tell me also Yosef Atage, the Dalet, it's maybe going to come and sit at the corner of the Dalet. And we know the difference between a Dalet and a Resh is simply the corner, and it's going to erase the Dalet and make it look like a Resh. And so imagine in the word Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and it erases the corner and it makes it Acher, another God. Of course, that would be terrible. Davar Echad Yeshli, he said, don't worry about that. I have something that I put into my ink on Kankantum Shema. It's called Kankantum. Shani Mato Techadia. I put it into the ink, and it's not going to become erased. It'll always be leave a mark, and therefore you don't have to worry about it. So this is the end of that second teaching. So this contradicts the first brisa, because the first teaching said that he first studied by Rabbi Yishmael and then he studied by Rabbi Akiva, and the second one says that it was the other way around. And additionally, the first one says that Rabbi Akiva was the one that told him he cannot use the kankantum. And in the second brisa, it says he used the kankantum in front of Rabbi Akiva. And then when he came to Rabbi Yishmael, that's where he started challenging him about what he does with his ink. Kasha shimas al shemush, kasha al sasra. So both in the order of who he served and in the who prohibited it, there's a contradiction. So actually, the story of Rabbi Meir of how he went to study, not a contradiction. Why? Because at first, Rabbi Meir came, he wanted to study in front of Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Akiva was very sharp and would ask a lot of questions and analysis of the halachas. But he didn't have enough background knowledge to be able to analyze and keep up with Rabbi Akiva's challenges and questions and analysis of the halachos. Also, Rabbi Yishmael. So he went to study under Rabbi Yishmael, who taught the breadth of information, even though it wasn't the depth of the information. The Gemara, and so he acquired the breadth of information. Bahadar also came to Rabbi Akiva. Then he came back to study in front of Rabbi Akiva, and V'savar Svara, and once he had the breadth of information, now he can start analyzing the depth of the information. El Asar Asar Kasha, but who is the one that actually prohibited using the kankantum, using the iron in the ink? Kasha, that indeed is a question. We don't know which one is correct. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Eimer, Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says that Rabbi Meir used to say l'chol matil kankantum l'techad yod. For anything, any writing, whether it's tefillin, mezuzah, sefer Torah, you can put kankantum, this iron, into the ink. Chutz miparsha sota. Besides for the sota writing, when you write the part of the sota that you cannot write kankantum with kankantum in the ink. Essentially, even though you're writing a Torah, but since, as we'll see soon, there is an opinion that says that when you're doing the sota, the sota ceremony, the sota erasure of a parsha into water and having a drink, it doesn't have to be written specifically for her. It can be written previously. And in fact, it can even be a part of a Sefer Torah that is no longer usable, that you can cut out that section and use it for a sota. And therefore, when writing a Sefer Torah, you can write all the Sefer Torah with kankantum. But the part that is the sota section must be written without kankantum because you have to be able to erase it. Rabbi Yaakov said in the name of Rabbi Meir, no, you know what it means? not the Sefer Torah. Of course, the Sefer Torah, you're not going to use that. It means when writing a specific sota text in the Beis HaMikdash for a sota occurrence, that's where you have to write it with regular ink, and it may not have the iron in it, the kankantamin. My benayos. What's the basis of this? The question is, can you use a text out of the Torah, not something that was specifically written for her? And it's a similar disagreement as to this other brisa that we're about to learn. The Tani we learned in a brisa, what was written for this particular sota is not going to be valid for another sota. Let's say she backs out and she says, I don't want to drink, and I'm willing to take responsibility and not drink. There, it's fine. So we don't erase the parsha. So it's already been written. So we say, oh, now we'll just save it for the next sota occurrence. It's invalid. It must be written for her. Whereas Rav Acha said, no, not true. Doesn't have to be written specifically for her. It's valid as long as it's the text, and therefore you can even use an old Sefer Torah. Amar Papa Dilman, the Gemara says, how can you compare the two disagreements? Maybe they're not alike. And arguing about a Sefer Torah and arguing about written for one woman and then used for another are two different subjects. Because the first opinion only said it over there. When you wrote it for a specific one woman, you can't then use it for another woman. But a Torah wasn't written for anybody, so then you can use it for this particular woman. Torah, the Stama Michtava was just written generically. So well, for a Torah, not generic, but it's not written for a specific person. So then it'll be valid for either. And it will be valid to erase for any sota. And similar the other way around as well. Perhaps it's not a similar argument. Rav Acha said that you can use what was written for one woman for another woman because it was written for a sota. But by the Torah text, which was written for studies, it was written to read the Torah. Perhaps he would say that you cannot erase that. So they're not comparable. It's true that we have two places that there are opinions that say that it doesn't have to be written specifically for the woman. It could be written otherwise. But the one opinion says it could be written for the Torah. The other says it could be written for another woman. And they may not be the same because it could be written for one woman is not going to be valid for the other one. Or it could be written at least for sota as valid. But if it's written for Torah, for studies, it doesn't count. And it would seem like Rav Acha says that if it was written for one woman, you can still use it as for a different sota, is going to disagree with this halacha in regards to get. Ahad Tanani is going to disagree with this Mishnah that says, Kasav get legarishes ishta. Somebody writes a get to divorce his wife. We turn to 13b, Yud Gimel Amud Beis, v'nimlach. And after he had the get written by the scribe, and he has the get in his hand, he says, you know what, bad idea. I'm going to work on my marriage and put it together again. I'm not going through with divorce. And somebody else in the city who shares the same name, Va'amar, and so he says to him, sir, I know that you had written a get for your wife and you don't want it. And your name is exactly my name. And your wife's name is exactly like my wife's name. So the text of the get can be shared. And therefore, since you're not using it, let me use your get. Puzzle, it's going to be it's going to be invalid. Puzzle lagarish, but Sagmar says, and so too over here by the sota, if it was written for one, it should be invalid for the other. The Gemara says no comparison at all. How can you compare the two? There by a get, which is in this week's parsha, in this coming week's parsha, the Torah says, "V'kasav la sefer karisas," and you shall write for her a divorce document. So it has to be la lishma. It has to be written for her name. But over here by Sota, it doesn't say it has to be written for her. It says it has to be done for her. The doing here is the erasure, and that can be done for her. But the writing can be a generic writing, it can be written for somebody else, and it's not a contradiction. Amar Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Chanina says it is well known before the one who said, spoke, and the world was created, before Hashem. That in the generation of Rabbi Meir, there was no one like him in his wisdom, in his depth, in his Torah. So why is it that we generally don't rule as a general rule as Rabbi Meir? Because they could not assess properly and understand when he was saying a final halacha and when he was making arguments for the depth of the argument, but not necessarily halacha. Because Rabbi Meir would sometimes, in order to analyze and show the depth of the halacha, he would say what was prohibited is permitted and argue for it in halacha, so that we can question the analysis of the halacha and get to the depth of learning, but not as an actual halachic opinion. And the Chachamim could not assess and understand when it was he being rhetorical and just asking the questions and making statements in order to sharpen the arguments so that we can clarify the halacha, and when he was actually ruling. And as such, the Chachamim didn't rule with Rabbi Meir on account of they couldn't really understand the depth of where his analysis ended and was a final ruling, and where they were theoretical arguments in order to sharpen the understanding of that halacha. Tana, so now the Brisa teaches, Lo Rabbi Meir Shemo. His name was actually not Rabbi Meir, even though we know him as such, but that wasn't his original name. Ela Rabbi Nehorai Shemo. Rather, his name was Nehorai. Meir means illumination. Nehorai is Aramaic illumination. He was called Rabbi Meir because he would illuminate the eyes of the Chachamim and Halacha in his rhetorical questions and his depth of analysis questions that he would ask, and his challenges to the Halacha that he would constantly challenge, made the Halacha bright and sharp in the eyes of the students. And therefore, he was called Rabbi Meir because he illuminated the halacha. And actually, Lo Nehorai Shemo. So here there are two versions. Is this a continuation on Rabbi Meir and saying, actually, his name wasn't even Rabbi Nehorai either. He had an original name before that as well. Or there was another person known as Rabbi Nehorai, and he was not Nehorai at first. He had a different name. And Nehorai wasn't his name was Nehemiah. And some say his name was originally Elazar ben Arach. So why was his name Nehorai? Because he illuminated the eyes of the Chacham and Halacha. So again, either this is Rabbi Meir in a continuation, that he had multiple name changes in the academy, or Rabbi Meir was originally Rabbi Nehorai, and there was someone else named Nehorai that was originally Rabbi Nehemiah or Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. Amar Rebbe, who was a student of Rabbi Meir, not for very long, but as a young child, he would have attended Rabbi Meir's classes, Rashi says, but however, he was so young that he wasn't sitting in front as students, but sat behind, auditing the class, as it were, from behind Rabbi Meir. And Rebbe said, the compiler of the Mishnah of Yehuda Nasi, he said, this sharpness, if I have any more than my friends, the Chazisil Rabbi Meir Ma'achari. It's on account of that I saw Rabbi Meir while he was teaching from behind, when I was sitting behind him. And if I had merited to see him up front when he was teaching, be even sharper. As it says in the verse, your eyes shall see your teacher. Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Meir had a student whose name was Sumchus. For every item and every matter that the Torah considers tamei, he would have 48 reasons or explanations to why it is tamei. And for every matter that was tahor, pure, you would have 48 explanations, reasons for it to be tahor. Tana, we learned another brisa. There was a well-trained student in Yavne that could permit a sheretz from Tuma with 150 reasons. Now, we know the Torah prohibits a sheretz, so it means that he was sharp enough that he can make some arguments. Tessa says, what kind of silliness is that? Making futile arguments? So in the simple meaning, it means that he was so sharp that he can make arguments even for that which wasn't true. And therefore, as we saw before, you had to be able to analyze and respond to find the truth and the depth of each halacha. But Tues has a different version as to what he was trying to do and in which halacha he was trying to prove. In any case, Amar Ravina, Ravina said, I could do the same. I could prove that a sheretz should be permissible. If a snake, which kills when it bites, can cause tumah, yet it itself does not have a tumah, sheretz she'ein meimis umar betumah. A sheretz does not kill, and therefore this rodent does not kill, and therefore does not cause tumah. L'kol shekait, wouldn't you say for sure that it itself is not tumah? The Gemara says, "Velohi." That's not a good argument at all. Kotz ba'al mekavit. The snake isn't killing. The death is happening on account of it could die from a thorn as well. An injury is what's killing it, and therefore the snake isn't causing tumah or not. The tumah happens as a result of death, and the death happens as a result of injury. Amar Rabbi Abba Shmuel, for Shmuel said, for 3 whole years, the students of the Academy of Shammai and the students of the Academy of Hillel, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, argued for 3 years. Each one saying the halacha is like us. We know, generally we say, Acharei Rabim Lahatos, that you follow the majority. However, Beis Shammai's students were sharper. And so they would say, Mechadadna Tvei, we are sharper and the halacha is like us. And Beis Hillel said, no, the halacha is like the majority. Yatza Baskel, a heavenly voice came out, V'amar, and said, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. These and these are the living words of God. It is often translated as the words of the living God. But I think that's not correct. I think the correct translation is Elu ve'elu, these and these, divrei Elokim chayim. These are the words of God that are alive. So they are the living words of God. And that's the meaning here, that it's the living words of God, and therefore they apply to halacha, and they are dynamic in halacha. Halacha ka Beis Hillel, and therefore the halacha is like Beis Hillel. Gemara says, if they are both living words of God, so then why is the halacha like Beis Hillel? Because they are pleasant, and even when they are challenged and they don't become defensive, they don't respond. And not only that, they would, whenever they would articulate their argument, they would articulate the opponent's argument as well. So that means that you're not only not defensive, which often causes arguments to become not seeking the truth, but rather to defend my opinion. So they're not defensive, and they're pleasant, and so therefore their arguments seek truth. And not only that, they can articulate their opponent's argument, Beis Shammai's argument as well, which tells us that they have a full grasp of the opponent's opinion and nevertheless have their opinion. And not only that, not only that, but they also articulate their opponent's argument before they articulate their own. Like we learned in regards to Sukkah, between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, whether a sukkah is valid if it's small enough if it's large enough to fit a head and most of the torso in the sukkah, or does it also have to have the food in the sukkah? So B'Shamai say it's invalid unless it can also have the food. Mesil will say that it's valid even if it has only head and torso and the food is outside. Amr B'Shamai said to B'Shamai, let us tell you, and they first said the elders of B'Shamai. Was it not that the elders of B'Shamai and the elders of B'Hillel went to visit Levakras Rabbi Yochanan ben Achurnis? And he was mostly, his head and torso were in the sukkah, but the food was in the house. Amr lehen B'Shamai, and B'Shamai responded, it's true. However, our elders said to him and then that if he always sits this way, he's never fulfilled the obligation of sukkah. Misham raya, afem amruloi. For there they said to him, "Im kacha yisa noig." If this is the way you always are, like yamta mitzvah sukkah meyamecha, you never fulfilled the mitzvah of sukkah. In any case, what we see is that the halacha is like them because they had humility, that they didn't become defensive, and therefore their arguments were able to be for the accuracy and the truth of the argument, and not to be correct and right, because they weren't being defensive, and they can articulate the opponent. And not only can they articulate the opponent's opinion, but they would do so more than before their own even. And this teaches you anybody that considers themselves humble, HaKadosh Baruch Hu makbil, Hashem will elevate it. But if people elevate themselves over others, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mashpila, in the end, Hashem brings them down. Somebody who's seeking greatness, seeking leadership or the spotlight, that runs away from him. And everybody that runs away from such positions, it comes chasing after him. Anybody that pushes the time, meaning they try and force the time either for their own position or for money, that the time will push him aside. But people that are patient and wait for the time, let their needs be set aside until the time is right. The time will come for it. Taner Rabbanon, the Brisa taught 2.5 years. Nechleku B'Shamai B'Hillel. B'Shamai B'Hillel had a disagreement. Is it better for a person to be born, or is it better for a person not to be born? After all, this life, we have many opportunities to make mistakes, and we do. Is it better that we not be born, or is it better now to be born? Now, it's a theoretical question that has seemingly no significance. There's a lot of discussion as to what relevance would this have. We're here. But in any case, it would have been better for a person not to have been born rather than been born. It's better to have been born rather than not born, because you have the opportunity to do mitzvah and good things. Nimnu v'gamru, but they both agreed to the conclusion. It would be better for a person that he were not born rather than take the chance of making mistakes. However, but Hashem did want us to be born, so we're here. A person needs to check their actions and see what mistakes they've done and fix them. Some say plan your actions out well so that you don't make mistakes to begin with.